Valuation. This is really the last truly big chapter we have to cover. I mean, we still have some odds and ends things to cover, but this is the last truly big chapter. And this is a truly big chapter, particularly math-wise. I would estimate that almost half of the math questions on the total exam will come from this one chapter. At least a third of the total math questions on the exam will come from this chapter. You will have to do several different CMA questions. You'll have to do several different cost approach questions. You'll have to do at least one income capitalization question. You're going to have, this is, the other math, it's like, okay, here's 10 math topics. You might see 3 of them on the exam, but you don't know which 3 you're going to see. It's kind of luck of the draw. In this chapter, you're going to see every single piece of math that we go over in this chapter on the exam at least once, if not twice. 100% guaranteed. They that strenuously get. And here's the reason. What is the single biggest piece of advice the Real Estate Commission says we should give to our clients, that we owe to every single client we ever represent? Advice about what?
Property valuation.
Property's value. That is the single biggest piece of advice that we give to any client. Because if you don't know what an estimated value is for the property, how can you give advice about negotiations? If you don't know what an estimated value for the property is, how can you advise them on what to list the property for, how to respond to an offer? Does that make sense? That most all of our advice sort of flows from this idea of value. This is the one thing that we're supposed to be an absolute expert on, is valuation. And so we do a lot of it in the class, we do a lot of it on the exam. So it's going to be a lot here. So the first thing you need to talk about when you bring up the subject of valuation is to get a baseline understanding for who does what. Appraisal. Appraisal is a process of coming up with a market value for a property. We don't do appraisals. Who do you think does?
Appraisers.
Appraisers. There's a big difference between what we do as brokers and what appraisers do. Primarily, they are more trained than we are. Theirs is still, though, no better than ours in the sense that it's an opinion of value. There's only one way to actually know what a property's worth. To do what? Sell it. That's the only real way to know a property's true value, is to sell it. Its sold price is its true value, because the idea is that if you market this thing to the masses and you give people plenty of access and plenty of competition, the market is going to settle that question of what the property's worth. Is everybody okay with that idea?
Yeah.
So whether it's an appraiser doing it or whether it's us doing it, we're just giving our opinion about what that number will be. It's a prediction. Does that make sense? When we're coming up with a value, we're predicting the future. We're trying to predict what we think that property would sell for if it were to be sold. Okay? Thing you need to know about appraisal or CMA or anything, not only are they opinions, they're very short value opinions. How long do you think they're good for?
1 day.
That day. They are snapshots in time. Because remember, buyers change every single day. The preferences of buyers changes every single day. So when people say, oh, I had my house appraised 6 months ago. Oh, yeah? I ate a hamburger 6 months ago. What's that to do with today? You know? This is a one-day thing. These are only valid for 1 day. Watch out for that on an exam. You know, these are still opinions of value, but they're only valid for 1 day. They're professional, formal opinions of value because they're done by an appraiser, whereas ours are informal opinions of value because we're not appraisers. Now, our opinions of value as real estate brokers come in 2 flavors. And really what they center around is whether we're doing them for a client or whether we're doing them for a customer. An opinion of value that we do for a client is called a CMA. comparative market analysis is what CMA stands for. A comparative market analysis is an opinion of value we do for a client. Clients who? Somebody we what?
Hold fiduciary.
Somebody we have fiduciary responsibility to, somebody we represent. We have a contract with, we have an agency agreement with them. We represent them. We owe them that CMA as part of our, that's one of our duties, that's one of our fiduciary obligations. Do we owe customers a CMA? No, we don't, because customers are people that what? We don't represent. We do not represent. We don't do CMAs for customers. We could give a customer an opinion of value. Now, we wouldn't give a customer an opinion of value if it would hurt our own client, right? But could I have somebody who just walks up to me and says, Dave, I'd like to know what this property's worth. And if Dave is a good real estate broker, could he give me a number on that? And Dave's going to look at me and say, well, who are you? I say, it's not important. I just want to know what that property's worth. Now, put yourself in Dave's shoes. Is he likely to want to do that for me, not knowing anything about me? No. How could I entice him to do that?
Pay him.
I could pay him. That is not called a CMA. It's the same process. He's not going to come up with the numbers any differently. But the Real Estate Commission has a different name for that thing, and you have to know that name. That's called a broker price opinion. When a third party pays you as a real estate broker for an opinion of value, it's called a broker price opinion. When you do it for a client, it's called what? CMA. Even if the client pays you for it, it doesn't matter. If you're doing it for your client, that's a CMA. If you're doing it for somebody who's not your client, that's a broker price opinion. So, I mean, let's say Dave is an investor, and he just wants to know what a particular property is worth. He has no intention of engaging me to represent him in the transaction. He doesn't want a buyer's agent. Maybe he's going to represent himself because he has a real estate license, but he doesn't really know the market, so he just wants to know what the property's worth. And he contacts a local real estate broker and says, I'll pay you $100 to give me a market analysis on that thing. Can a real estate broker do that? They can. We just call it what?
BPO.
A BPO, a broker price opinion. Now, for test-taking purposes, broker price opinions only done by who? Non-provisional brokers. This is one of those few things. Remember, there's not very many things on the list that provisionals can't do. This is one of them. Since there's so few things on the list that provisionals can't do you think those are targets for test questions? Yeah, you need to know that list of things that provisionals cannot do. They can't do BPOs. What else can they not do? Designated dual agency opposite their bid, right? And how about property management? They can't do property management. That's pretty much the list right there. Okay? Of things that a provisional broker cannot do. Everything else is okay. Yes?
Was there any limits to what you can charge, or is whatever the market is there?
It's whatever you want to charge. I mean, keep in mind, though, that ultimately there's another service provider out there who does this for a living. The motivation to use you is that you're cheaper than they are. Who are those other service providers that do this for a living? Appraisers. So, you know, my guess is there's probably an upper limit on what you could charge, because when you get to the point where you're close to charging what an appraiser charges, they're just going to go to an appraiser. So that's why they come to us, because we're cheaper.
And payment for the broker price opinion goes through the actual firm.
It does, because Pat's question is, if I'm paid for a broker price opinion, does that still come through my firm? And the answer is what? Yes. All compensation for brokers in this state goes through their firm.
And then
If you're affiliated with a firm, it goes through the firm.
You get the percent or whatever you're at.
Whatever split you have with your firm, you'd probably, you know, so say you got paid, and quite honestly, most of these things, most broker price opinions pay like $75. I'm not doing one, I tell you that. I'm not. But, some people do them. Some people do. Yes.
This might be off, but when you see ads where this says like free evaluate home value, that would be a provisional. I mean, that would be a provisional broker. right?
It could
If they're
be-
doing it for free?
It could be anybody. Most of the people who are offering that are trying to get you as a client. They're saying, you know, free to get your home value, because think to the next logical conclusion. People want to know what their house is worth because they might be thinking about what? About selling it. And so that's just a really good way to get somebody's contact information, because the broker's going to give them an opinion of value, and then they're going to say, well, don't you want to sell it? Because we've got buyers who will buy it for this. And so that's really just more of a marketing ploy. And, you know, and even that would still be considered a CMA because it's not charged for, right? It's always a CMA if you're doing it for a client or if you're not charging for it. It's only a BPO if you're doing it for somebody other than a client and you are charging for it. The reason this is a special thing is this used to be illegal. And it wasn't that many years ago. 3 years ago, this was illegal. Because the appraisers fought this tooth and nail. The appraisers don't want us doing this because they want somebody to have to go to them to get this opinion of value. Who do you think fought to have that law changed? It wasn't real estate brokers at all. Banks. Banks. Because the most common user of BPOs are lenders, particularly lenders who are thinking about foreclosing on a property. If you've got a borrower in default, what's going to dictate how fast you move forward with foreclosure? Whether or not you think you can do what? Sell it and get your money out of it. So before they decide whether or not to foreclose on that property, they want to have an idea of what the property's worth. They're sitting in an office somewhere in San Francisco. They got no idea what that property in Raleigh's worth, so they need somebody who's in Raleigh to give them an idea of what that house might be worth, so they'll know what it would sell for if it was a foreclosure. Does that make sense for you guys? So they'll call a real estate broker, and maybe they already have one on standby who does all their BPOs for them, and they'll pay them $65, $75 to pull up some market statistics and shoot them a number on that house. Well, that used to be illegal. You used to have to get an appraiser to do that, and it was actually the banks that led the charge to get the state law changed, and now they're allowed it, and we call them broker price opinions. Okay? And they do like to test on them because, again, it's one of those narrow little things that a provisional broker can't do. All right, is everybody good on that? So if I call it a CMA, that means it's either for who? Client, or it's for free, no charge, right? That's always a CMA, and anybody can do it. Provisionals can do them, non-provisionals, doesn't matter. A BPO is no different than a CMA as far as the actual numbers are concerned. I would come up with the exact same number for a BPO as I would for a CMA. But because I'm selling it for a fee, for whatever reason, they decided that provisional brokers weren't going to be allowed to do that.
Yeah, so what's the logic behind that?
Who knows? I really,
It's a great question.
It's one I could never figure out what the, you know, what the logic was. But, you know,
It is what it is.
it is what it is. Yeah.
It's a
So
hurdle.
since the money go through the firm, so it had to be written in, like, you had to have it in writing, they can't just give you $100 bill or something.
They cannot just give you a $100 bill. That is right. They have to have an engagement contract, just like an agency agreement. You know, anytime you're going to get paid, you got to have a written contract in this business. So you have to have an engagement agreement, and then they have to pay your firm, and then your firm would pay you according to whatever your contract was with your firm.
Have you seen them?
I'm
Do
sorry?
you see them a lot or no?
I don't. Here's what I understand. The people that do them do an absolute ton of them. You know, the people that do these do like 10 a day of them. You know, so that's the only way it's worth their while. You know, they're on like speed dial with the bank, and that's all they do all day long is pull market statistics and do these opinions of value for the bank. And some now we're never allowed to do them if we realize it's being used for making a loan. Like in other words, if a lender's trying to use this in place of an appraisal, we have to decline. We can't do it. You know, like if somebody's trying to refinance their house and the lender contacts you to try to get you to do a broker price opinion, you have to refuse that assignment. It can't be used to underwrite a loan. We're not allowed to do
It's
that.
gonna be an HVCC violation.
I'm sure it is. I'm sure it is. But the Real Estate Commission just tells us if you know it has anything to do with a loan, step away from it. You know, it can have to do with foreclosure, but not actual making a loan. All right, we good on this? Broker price opinion. As far as another test question, BPOs should use this exact language. you will see that exact language if they put it in probable sales or probable selling price. When you report a value on a BPO, you have to use that exact language. That's what the rule says. That's the only way it gets us out of trouble with the appraisal board, is to, if we use that exact language, probable sales price. Okay? There are lots of factors that affect value, and you don't have to memorize these. It's just a general idea here. The more in demand something is, what's its value going to do? Go up, right? The more useful it is, the more value it has. Those are pretty simple topics. Now, you do need to know these terminologies: market value, market price, and cost. Market value is a prediction. It's what it might be worth. Market value is what we're establishing with a CMA, or a BPO, or an appraisal. Because those are all best guesses at what it might what? Sell for. It's a prediction of what we think it will sell for. Whereas market price is what it did sell for. That's the difference between market value and market price. Market value is in the future, market price is in the past. Does that make sense? Okay? One's a prediction, one's just a statement of this is what it sold for. And then this last one, cost. This is more just a note. We all know what cost means. But cost has very little meaning when you're talking about value. In general, we do not factor in the cost of an improvement when we're coming up with the value of an improvement. What things cost have no relevance on their value when we're predicting value. Because again, what are we predicting? What a buyer will what? Pay for it. I don't care if the granite countertops cost $5,000. What I care about is what will a buyer pay for the house that has granite countertops versus the house that doesn't have granite countertops. That differential is the value of the countertops, not what the cost was. So, and that's why some things have a positive return on investment and some things have a negative return on investment. The most classic example of a negative return on investment is a swimming pool. I mean, swimming pools can cost $100,000 or more. You're never going to see that sort of return of investment. You're never going to find a buyer that's willing to pay $100,000 more for that house with the pool than without it. They might be willing to pay $15,000, $20,000 maybe more for that house with it. So then what's the value of the pool?
$20,000.
It's the 15 or 20, not the 100 that it actually costs. Okay, that's just a generic sort of point about value.
Unless it comes with its own bar server.
Well, then maybe they'd be willing to pay more about it.
Unless it's in Michigan.
Unless it's in Michigan, that has a negative return value. I told y'all my mom filled ours in, right? Did I ever tell you that?
Yeah.
I had one growing up, my mom filled it in with the front end loader. She did. She sure did. Came home. My dad brought me home from school one day and she was scooping dirt out of the field and dumping it into the swimming pool. She said, I've cleaned it for the last time. No kidding. When she finished, all that was left was the rail from the steps was sticking up out of the ground. My dad had to go out there with a hacksaw and cut it off because it was just like just random stainless steel rails sticking up out of the ground. So, highest and best use. We talked about this earlier in the class. What is highest and best use? It's the one thing that what?
You can get the most value from
That we can do with the property that brings the greatest return on investment, right? Here's where this becomes really important. When appraisers go look at a property, folks, they don't value it as a house just because it's a house. What's the first question they ask themselves when they're doing the appraisal? What's the first job? To decide what? What is the highest and best use? And then they value it as if it was being used for that purpose, because that's going to give a much better indication of what a buyer would be willing to pay for that property. Does that make sense for you guys? So even if it's a house that's sitting there, but we recognize that it's zoned commercial and it's in an area that would be very advantageous for a gas station, we're gonna value it as if it's a vacant commercial lot, because that's the highest and best use of that property, not as a residential property. So the first job of an appraiser when they go to try to find a value for a property is actually to answer that question. What's the highest and best use of this property? And then let me figure out what the valuation is going to be. Everybody okay with that? All right, good. And that can change over time, of course, highest and best use. These principles of value could potentially pop up on a test. I don't want to spend much time on them, and there's only a couple here. Substitution. Substitution is probably the most important one for residential real estate transactions. I call this the Walmart principle. When you're given two things that are relatively even, the same product, which one are people going to buy most often? The cheaper, the least expensive one, right? And we see that in retail settings all the time. The same thing is true in real estate. If you have two homes that are relatively the same on the market in the same neighborhood, which one is most likely going to go under contract first? The one that is less expensive. It is just a very natural flow of things. And so that leads us to this idea that we can essentially substitute one property for another as long as we know what properties have sold for. So this becomes the basis for how we come up with a value for things. You do this all the time already without even realizing you're doing it. When you shop for things, when you sell things. How many of you have ever sold a car? When you sold it, before you decided what to sell it for, what was the first thing you did? You went and looked at what other similar cars, same model, same make, same engine, same body style, sold for, right? Because that gave you a very good indication of probably what you could sell yours for. Value in a house is really no more complex than that, folks. We're looking for the most similar possible thing we could find that's already done what? It's already sold, and then we're going to start with that as our basis for comparison. That's the principle of substitution. That's what the principle of substitution means. Okay? The principle of conformity. We know we all like to think that we value uniqueness. Unfortunately, that is not true economically. When you look economically, particularly with real estate, the biggest return on your investment is to be conforming, to be like everyone else. It's not the house that stands out that brings the greatest return on value. It's the one that is the most similar to everything else that surrounds it. This principle of conformity says you're going to get the highest return on your investment by conforming to your surroundings. In other words, you don't want to be over-improved or under-improved. You don't want to be the $800,000 house in a neighborhood of $400,000 houses, and you don't want to be the $400,000 house in the neighborhood of $800,000. Either one of those is a bad investment, economically speaking, in most cases. That's just the principle of conformity. And then this last one is the one we already hinted on when we talked about cost, the principle of contribution. So when we talk about the principle of contribution, we simply say that the value of any improvement is equal to the value that it contributes to the overall of the property. And so the example I've given you here, it says a fireplace. If you take a fireplace and you're trying to figure out what's that fireplace worth, well, the best way to get the answer to that question is to find two identical homes, or as identical as they can possibly be, in the same area, same neighborhood, same style, same size, with the one exception being what? That one has a fireplace and one does not. If you could, in theory, find two absolutely identical properties and the only difference was a fireplace, couldn't you look at the difference in sales price to figure out what a buyer is willing to pay for a fireplace? Because in theory, if that buyer pays $1,500 more for the house with the fireplace, then the fireplace must have added $1,500 in value. So when we get to making these adjustments, often people ask me, well, where did that number come from? Well, for your purposes, they gave it to you. Right. So just use it and be happy. Right? In the real world, Where those numbers come from is by making those comparisons. Appraisers and they will look at lots of data and they will try to isolate down differences. Okay, well here's a house that sold with 3 baths for $280,000, and here's a house that sold with 2 baths for $270,000. They're pretty dang similar otherwise, so a full bath must be worth $10,000 because that's what the difference was that buyers were willing to pay for those 2 properties. Does that make sense? Okay, that is this principle of contribution. So there are 3 methods or approaches or ways to predict the market value of property. Now, which way is an appraiser going to use when they go out to value a piece of property?
The highest and best.
The highest and best use. Well, how do you think they determine the highest and best use? They check all 3. So when an appraiser goes out to value a piece of property, they do all 3 approaches with that piece of property. And the way they can tell you what the highest and best use is whichever one of these produces the highest number, that's the best use of that particular piece of property. Does that make sense for you guys? Because each one of these correlates to a particular type of use. If the property yields the highest value using the sales comparison approach, we should be using it as either residential property or vacant land, because that's what lines up with the sales comparison approach. Now for you guys, we're not appraisers. We don't have to be that fancy. When we go out to value a piece of property, what do? It's residential. What am I going to do?
Sales comparison.
I'm going to do sales comparison approach. Does that make sense for you guys? Because we don't have that task of deciding what the highest and best use is. We just, what you see is what you get with us, because we're not appraisers. But an appraiser goes out and they're supposed to look at the big picture and come up with all three different values and look at which one is the highest. Yes?
But if it's just zoned residential, why would they have to do that?
That's a good question, and we'd have to get an appraiser to answer that question, because they have guidelines that say they have to do all 3.
I mean, if you can't put a gas station in your subdivision, why?
That's it. Why would you? I agree completely. But when you'll see when you look at a real appraisal form, it will show all 3 approaches, and and so sometimes I think they just make up a number and stick it on there and say, oh, we're using the income capitalization approach. It's $98,000. We don't know where that came from, but it's a number.
Maybe they have to prove it's not.
Well, that they do. I mean, and that's the idea, is to prove that it is being used for what it should be used for. Okay? So for your purposes, you need to know which one correlates with which one for the test. Okay? Because they may ask you which approach to value is likely to be used for a certain type of property. So, for residential property and vacant land, residential and vacant land go together, that's going to be the sales comparison approach, which is the type that you talked about with your used car, right? Where you go and you look, how much did that most similar thing sell for? That's going to be the basis for my pricing. And that's what we're going to do the most of as real estate brokers, because most of us are going to end up valuing what kind of property? Residential. This is a CMA. A CMA is the sales comparison approach. Alright? So when you hear real estate brokers talking about, oh, I got to go do a CMA, they're talking about doing the sales comparison approach. Just remember, it's not only residential, but also what? Vacant land. Vacant land. Okay? No matter whether that's residential vacant land or commercial vacant land, any vacant land, we're going to use the sales comparison approach. Good on that?
Yep.
We also have, and I'll skip down here to the bottom one, the income capitalization approach. That's going to be the way we value any income producing property, which is mostly going to be commercial real estate. But could it be a house that we buy because we want to produce income with it?
Yes.
Guess what? It's not going to be valued using the sales comparison approach. It's going to be valued using the income approach. Because if I'm buying it as an investment property, whether it's an apartment complex or an office building or a farm or a house, it's only worth to me the income that it produces for me. Does that make sense for you guys? So any income producing property, we're gonna predict the value of it using something called the income capitalization. This is all the math you're gonna have to learn, these different approaches to valuing property. And then the last one is called the cost approach. The cost approach is what we use for everything else, the other stuff that doesn't fit. It's not residential, it's not vacant land, and it doesn't produce income. So these would be like public buildings, special use buildings, churches, schools, fire departments, libraries, university buildings would be valued using the cost approach, primarily for insurance purposes. Because even though we don't need to know how much they would sell for, because you never sell a school, we do need to have a value for in case the thing burns down, so that we can have it insured. Does that make sense? All right? You follow me on these three approaches, okay? So you ready to learn the first one?
Yes.
All right. Let's talk about the sales comparison approach, okay? With the sales comparison approach, the property that we're trying to value is called the subject property. The subject property is the one that we're trying to value, the one that we're trying to predict what it would sell for. The properties that we're going to use to come up with that value are called the comparable properties, or just comps. The comps. How many of you have ever heard that phrase before, that word? I'm looking for comps. It's short for comparable properties. So, if you were searching for comparable properties, what do you think number one criteria would be?
Location, relevance
How
to
soon
sale.
it's sold?
I love that word, sold. That's number one criteria. Because here's the thing, we don't ever want to be comparing to properties that are listed. Because oftentimes, do properties sell for less than what they're listed for? Or potentially more than what they're listed for? Remember, the listing price is just somebody's best guess of what they think they can get for it, right? We want to start as a point of comparison with what people actually paid for these properties. So first, most important criteria when you're selecting comps is sold. Now, then, so add that word to it, Dave. Recently sold. So the more recent, the better, right? The more recent, the better. So now talk about some other criteria that'd be super important. You said location, right? Distance. So location, distance, same neighborhood would be real good, right? Could we go to a different neighborhood if it was a similar neighborhood with similar characteristics? Absolutely. We would only go to a different neighborhood if we couldn't find one in the what? Same neighborhood. These are the kinds of things where you start tight and you work your way out, right? I would start same neighborhood, same style, within the last 3 months sold. Same size. Well, maybe I only find one. But what do I know about that one? It's a great one. Right? I know that is a great comp because it's nearly identical. If it's the same size in the same neighborhood with the same basic style that sold within the last 3 months, that is a slam dunk for predicting what my property, subject property, is going to be worth. Does that make sense for you guys? Now, we just want to keep edging out until we finally find at least 3. 3 to 5. At least 3, no more than 5. That's the ideal for a CMA. At least 3, no more than 5. Is everybody good on selecting comps? Let me tell you things you don't want to use, and this is going to show up on a test because they're going to ask you to choose comps on a test. Okay? Tell you things you don't want to use. Number 1, never, if possible. Now, sometimes you don't have a choice, but sometimes if you are valuing a property where I grew up, there's probably been 3 houses that sold in the last 30 years. You take what you can get when you're in that situation, okay? But for your purposes on a test, never contradictory styles. Don't compare a ranch house to a 2-story house. That's a terrible comparison. How many square feet of roof is on a 2,000 square foot 2-story house? 1,000. Because you got 1,000 square feet on the first floor and 1,000 square feet on the second floor, but it only takes 1,000 square feet of roof to cover the thing, right? How many square foot of roofing is on a 2,000 square foot ranch house? 2,000. 2,000. Which one's more expensive to build?
The ranch.
How much land does a 2,000 square foot two-story house take up versus a 2,000 square foot ranch house? Significantly more for the ranch, right? Half the space for the two-story. Much more land development costs. Foundation, same thing. You got twice as much foundation involved. Ranches are hugely more expensive to construct. Also, is there a huge difference in the livability factor in a ranch versus a two-story? Let me tell you something. I'm not old, but I live in a ranch, and it was by accident. It is the best accident I ever had in my life, because I can tell y'all, these damn 3-story townhouses that I show my clients, I don't even go up to the top anymore. I'm like, I'll be down here. Y'all let me know how it is. I'm tired. You know, like after about the third one, you know, because I know what would happen. I'd be all the way up on the 3rd floor and think about I needed something out of the trunk of my car. About I ain't getting in the car. You know,
2 floors.
and so that wears on people after a while. And so there's a huge difference in what people are willing to pay for the convenience of not having to deal with the stairs. Not to mention, we haven't talked about it yet, but when we have talked about living area, right? We have talked about when you compute living area. What floor do those stairs count as living area on? Both. Well, it's living area, but is it useful area to you? No. So if you have a 2,000 square foot 2-story house, there's probably 150, 180 square feet of that that's just the stairs. Whereas if you have a 2,000 square foot ranch house, how much of that is useful? All of it. Think about that. That's a 10 by 18 room that you have additionally in the ranch house versus the 2-story. Are people going to pay significantly more for that? Yes, so you don't want to be comparing those two things. Yeah, you want to stay within the same style. If my subject's 2-story, what do I want my comps to be? 2 stories. Does that make sense? Okay. So we want to stay as similar as we possibly can. Another no-no on a test. You don't want to use distressed properties as comps. Things that sold as foreclosures. Things that sold as short sales. Why? Is that a good indication of what market value is going to be? No, because people probably paid significantly less for those properties because of the conditions of the sale. Does that make sense? Another no-no on a test when you're choosing comps. Make sure these are arm's length transactions. What does that phrase arm's length mean, do you think?
Close.
It means not too close, right? It means it wasn't sold to who?
Your sister.
Their sister, my mama, some family member. We don't ever want to use comps that were sold like on short notice or, you know, sold to a family member of the seller, because most likely that's not a true indication of market value. Does that make sense? You know, so be careful with those sorts of things. Yes?
Now I have a question, because we had an appraiser come and do an appraisal on our home before we sold it, and they pulled comps. Our home was a ranch with a walkout basement. But they pulled comps from a 2-story, and we argued back and forth, because I was like, my home is 2,000 square foot with a basement, and they wanted to compare it to a 2-story house. And they still, it was back and forth because they said it was the same because mine had a basement in the ground. And I said, no, yours over here is 2-story.
How urban or rural of an area are we talking about?
It was in the city. So, I
It's
mean.
in the city? Well, I mean, I would say in a city, you probably should be able to find better comparable properties than that. Now, if you're in a very rural area where there's not many things to compare, you have to make a lot of sacrifices. You don't want to, you know, remember the goal is always to find the best comps, whatever they are. There's no, when I give you rules like that, those are for test taking purposes, right? In the real world, the best comps are whatever the best comps are. I mean, you know, sometimes the best comps are terrible ones, but they're the best ones that are available. So, you know, I can't really say they did anything wrong. I'd have to look at what comps were available. What ones did they choose not to use in order to include that one?
And that's what they told us. They said there wasn't too many houses that had sold at that time.
They just didn't have many comps to choose from.
And they didn't have many, so that's why I was like, okay.
Yeah. Yes, Dave.
So you also don't want to use comps to have like for instance, if this house is similar to this house, but this has a sunken living room, if it's not something that's popular today. these
Right,
days.
right.
What's
Again,
that called?
well, you'd wanna do that if your subject had a sunken living room, right? Again, so the idea is it's called obsolescence.
That's
Yeah.
what.
The idea is to stay as similar as you possibly can. So on a test, they're almost always gonna be asking you to filter which one of this list is the best, right? So you're gonna, keeping in mind, there's no set in stone rules, but you're gonna be looking for which one is the best of what they've given you just by applying those kind of criteria to it. All right? Good with that? Good. Now, what we do in the sales comparison approach, once we've chosen the comps, is to make adjustments for areas where they're not identical. It's very rare to find a comp that's perfectly identical to your subject property. If you do, great, you don't need to make an adjustment. I mean, if you find the exact size in the exact same neighborhood that sold last week, I don't need to make an adjustment. I just need to say, well, here's what it's going to sell for, because that's what that one sold for. But would you agree that it's very unusual to find identical comps? There's going to be some variations here, maybe slight differences in square footage, or this one's 2.5 baths and my subject is 2 baths. We're going to have some things that aren't quite the same. That's where our adjustments come in, and that's where the math comes in with the sales comparison approach, is making adjustments. And I went through the selected comp stuff already. So, when you make adjustments, what the comparable property sold for is your starting point. That's the number you're adjusting up or down from, the sales price of the comparable property. That's the reason we took all this time choosing comps, is because we're going to take what that property sold for as our starting point. Is everybody with me on that? Now, when we make adjustments, they're designed to make the properties more equal to each other. We want the properties as equal to each other as they possibly can be. Number one rule: never, ever, ever adjust the subject property. You cannot adjust the subject property. What's your starting point? The sales price of the what? The comp. So guess what? The adjustments all have to be applied to the comp. You always make the adjustments to the comp. You don't adjust the subject to the comp, you adjust the comp to match the what? To match the subject. So if you've watched any of the videos online where I've taught chapter 17, you've already seen this. If you haven't, this is the dumbest looking thing in the world. But it works. Okay? So I want you to hold your hands in front of you. Just like this. Your left hand, this is your left hand. Your left hand is your subject property. Okay? This does not move. No matter how hard I try, this arm is locked in place because we never adjust what? The subject property. When we start to make these comparisons, my comp is in my right hand. And that can move any which way. The goal is to have them be what? Equal. So, no matter what criteria we're looking at, let's just say square footage. My subject is 2,000 square feet. Well, it doesn't matter if it's 2,000, 20,000, or 200. It's always right here because the subject is always locked, right? So my subject is 2,000 square feet. Let's say my comp is 2,200 square feet. Where is that? That's up here, right? What do I have to do to make them even to each other? I have to bring it down, right? Because I can't move this one, so the only way to make them even is to bring this one down. Is that going to be a negative adjustment or a positive adjustment?
Negative.
That is a negative adjustment. Here's why I say that looks stupid, but it works. The number one mistake of doing the math in this section is going up when you should go down, or down when you should go up. Because they will always twist the language around to try to make you mess up. But if you always make it about, here's the subject, and where's the comp in relation to it, you will always know which way you need to go, down or up. Because you're always making the comp equal to the subject. Well, if the comp is smaller than the subject, what do we need to do? We need to add, right? If the subject has 3 full baths and the comp has 4 full baths, we need to bring it down by the value of what? A bathroom. We need to take away a bathroom. Does that make sense? That's the way these adjustments are going to
I'm
work.
gonna find myself doing that.
Alright? You better do it on the test.
You're looking like you're crazy.
Alright? If the comparable property is better than the subject property, you adjust the sales price of the comp down. If the comp is better, which way do you go? Down. If the comp is worse, you go up. Now let me ask you this. What if they say the subject property is better than the comp by $2,000? I cannot deal with that statement. That is a nonsense statement from a CMA standpoint, but they'll give it to you exactly like that. The subject property's location is better by $2,000. Flip it around in language based on the comp, because it's the comp that we have to adjust, right? If the subject is better, then the comp is what? Worse, right? Stop trying to do the math and just flip it around and make it about the comp. If it says the subject property is better by $2,000, you just go comp's worse by $2,000, right? And now you got it. Subject's here, comp is where?
Down there.
Is down there, so which way are you going to adjust? Up. See, here's the thing. If you tried to do that any other way, if I said subject property is better by $2,000, what in your brain does it say you need to do?
Yeah, bring it.
It says I need to subtract, right? Because I already said it was better, but that's wrong because we're talking about the subject, not the comp. The subject is better by $2,000. You've got to read that as comp is worse by $2,000. You've always got to put it in language of the comp because it's the comp you're adjusting. Are we okay on that? All right. So always put it in language of the comp. Now, here's an example of an adjustment. It says, in attempting to value the property at 123 Main Street in Garner, Diane finds a very similar comparable property that sold for $150,000 last month. The home at 123 Main Street has 3 full baths, but the comparable property only has 2. Full baths in the area are valued at $8,000 each. Based on this information, what's the indicated value of the subject property? So, when we line them up, the only thing they gave us a difference in was what? Bathrooms, right? That's the only thing they highlighted a difference in, so we have to assume everything else is the same. Subject property, how many baths does it have? How many?
3.
Subject property has
3.
hold on, 1, 2, 3, right? Well, the subject's always here, right? So in this hand is 3. Now the comp, how many does it have? 2. So is that worse or better?
Worse.
It's worse, right? It's down here because 3, 2. Does that make sense? So which way do I have to adjust to make them even? I've got to adjust up. By how much money? $8,000. So what I would do is add $8,000 to whatever the comp sold for, which in this case was how much money? $150. So what's my indicated value or probable sales price going to be? $158. Does that make sense? All right, that's the way the adjustments work. Square footage adjustments are usually done with just dollar per square foot. You'll usually be given an adjustment number. You know, houses are being constructed at $100 a square foot, or $110 a square foot, or $80 a square foot. In that case, you're simply going to look at how many square feet the difference is and then multiply that times the cost per square foot. All right? So, there's an example here. It says we're doing a CMA for 402 Oak Drive. We find a recently sold comp that has 1,950 square feet. So the way I would start doing this if I were you, don't try to process all of this. When you see you're doing a CMA, write down subject, comp, so you can compare them side by side. In conducting a CMA for 402 Oak Drive, we find a recently sold comparable property that has 1,950 square feet. Is it the comp or the subject that's 1,950? The comp. So we got 1,950 square feet for the comp. and sold for $287,000. I always put the sales price up here at the top, because again, that's the starting point for my adjustments, right? So we're gonna put that up there at the top. Finished living area is valued at $110 per square foot. Well, we know we're gonna need that to make our adjustment. If we measure the subject property and find it has 1,800 square feet, so what am I gonna do with the 1,800? Put it under the subject, right? Because I need to see what my differences are. What's the probable sales price of 4020 Drive? Well, now, first question, do I need to make an adjustment? Are they different?
Yes.
Yes, they are different, and so therefore I need to make an adjustment. Especially if they've given, sometimes they'll give you small differences that they don't give you an adjustment for. Well, guess what? Then don't adjust for it. If they say one's 8 years old and one's 9 years old and they don't tell you to make an adjustment for that, don't worry about it, okay? But in this case, they gave us $1 per square foot adjustment. So, how many square feet is my subject property?
18.
Subject property is 1,800 square feet, right? Remember, that's always in the same place. Where's my comp? Is it better or is it worse? It is better, higher. So which way do we have to adjust?
Down.
Down. So we know, and here's the thing, write that down before you even do any math. Go ahead and write down, this is a negative adjustment. Then do the math. And then you've already got it figured out which way you're going. So, how much are we going down? The value of how many square feet?
150.
150 times how much per square foot? $110 per square foot. What is that, 16,000? So, that's going to be minus $16,500, right? So, what does that give us as an indicated value for our subject property? How would we do that? We would start at where it sold for, and it sold for $287, and then what are we doing? Subtracting 16,500. So what are we left with? 270, 500. That's our indicated sales price or probable sales price based on that one comp with that one adjustment. How are we feeling about that so far? Yes?
Would this be done with new construction? Since they're all kind of the same, like if they have 3 model homes and they're all kind of around the same, would you still do comps for that?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, we've got to value everything.
Okay.
You absolutely have to value everything. So when you come in, you take me through it. I'm trying to sell one of those houses. What comps am I looking for?
The same size, model.
Same floor plan, right? If I can find recently sold ones of the exact same floor plan in that exact same neighborhood, wouldn't those be the best possible comps? That's what I would be looking for.
Can't you just get the options list from the
You could,
builder and
absolutely.
just
That's why
tell you
new
how-
construction is a dream when it comes to
Okay.
valuing the property, because it's at that point as similar as it's ever going to be, right? The old, and generally speaking, the older the neighborhood, the less similar they become, because people start to do what? Improvements, make renovations. Some have been renovated, some are not. You know, some have had additions, some don't. You know, whereas brand new neighborhood, they're all relatively similar, because like you said, there's only going to be 3 or 4 different floor plans.
Yeah. Okay.
Yep.
So how does a builder, like, I guess, form a plan of what that's going to be worth at that point if it's never been sold? There's something comparable in that specific
Yeah,
development.
that's kind of.
So they look at market statistics of other similar properties in the area and
Okay.
usually add like a new premium to it. You know, so I mean, it's just like selling a new car. A new house has a new premium on it, just like a new car does. You know, that new car smells not free, right? And the same thing is true with a house. There's always a little bit of a premium tacked onto. So if you think, and that's a discussion you have to have sometimes with people who are selling their house in a neighborhood where they're still competing with the new construction. You know, if you buy in a neighborhood and 2 years later the builder's still building in there, you may have the exact same floor plan, the exact size, but you're never going to sell your house for what they're selling theirs for. But and so it always amazes me that I have to give this speech to sellers and I have to look at them and say, if you were given the choice between 2 identical homes, except one was a resale and the other is brand spanking new, which one would you pay more for? And they look at you and go, well, I guess. No, you don't guess, you know. You don't want to hear it, but you know, right? So there's, so there's a premium attached to new for sure. All right? We understand how to make this adjustment? Okay? Now, if you haven't already sort of figured out, they get more complex than this.
Oh, yeah.
Because what's going to happen is you're going to have to make several adjustments on the same set of comps, right? So far, we've only had one adjustment on each one of these. But, could we have had like a bathroom adjustment and a square footage adjustment and a garage adjustment? That's where we're headed. We're headed to ones where we're making several adjustments to come up with these values. Yes?
Do we need to know inferior and superior?
So inferior means worse than, right?
Right.
Superior means better than. All you need to know are your hands. And so when you read it, don't try to figure out what they're talking about. Just literally do it with your hands. If it says to you, well, the subject property is superior to the comparable property, well, first of all, flip that language around, because we don't want to know what the subject property is, we want to know what the what? The comp is. So if it says the subject property is inferior to the comp, then you read that as the comp is superior to. So here's my subject, the comp is what? Above or superior, so which way are we adjusting? Down, and we always adjust which one? The comp, right? So your answer is going to be adjust the sales price of the comp down to match the subject property. Okay? That makes sense?
Yes, sir.
That's the way you handle those questions.
That's what I'm gonna be doing.
I'm telling you, this thing, you look like a moron, but it works. I mean, the good thing is, you all know what you're doing, so nobody's going to be like, what the hell are you doing over there? Now, when you go take the state exam, you may get some funny looks, but you'll be the ones walking out of there passing, and the other ones won't, so it's okay. And the funny thing is, I've had students come back and take the state exam, and they call me and they say, I was in there and there was somebody else doing this, and so I waited when they came out and they're like, oh, when you were in Travis's class? Oh, I wasn't, but I watched his videos. So you'll see random people doing the hands thing, so it definitely helps. Again, your brain's going to be mush in a 4-hour exam. Anytime you can take the having to concentrate so deeply out of it and just make it something as simple as a visual game with yourself, and you'll be much better off. Okay? Now, bathrooms and garages are things that confuse people when we start making adjustments. They don't have to be as confusing. Here's what you need to think. First of all, a half bathroom, is not half a full bathroom, okay? That's the first thing you need to just accept. A 1-car garage is not half of a 2-car garage. You need to accept that. Because until you accept that, you won't be able to make the proper adjustments. They are two separate things. So when you see on a CMA question 3 baths, you're not going to write 3 baths. You're going to write 3 full, 0 half. When you see 2.5 baths, you're going to write 2 full, 1 half. Because what you're going to have to actually do is make 2 adjustments sometimes. And this is so here's what I mean by that. Let's say we have a subject that is 2.5 baths. Okay? So, how am I going to write that down? I'm going to write 2 full and 1 half. Does that make sense? And we have a comp that is 3 baths. So, how am I going to write that down?
3 full.
3 full
0 half.
and 0 half. See, when I write it that way, do you see that there's actually 2 things that I need to adjust for?
Right.
I got to fix 2 things, because I got to make this line the same, and I've got to make this line the same. Does that make sense for you guys? So let's just say they've told us on this question that a full bath is worth $9,000, and a half bath is worth $6,000. Okay? So let's take it one step at a time. We'll start with the fulls. Subject. It's always right here. I don't even need to know the number. Well, how many is it now? What's the number for my subject? How many full baths do I have? 2 full. How many do I have in my comp? 3. So which way do I adjust? Down. So I'm coming down by the value of what?
$9,000.
Which is 1 full bath, right? I need to subtract 1 full bath. Does that make sense? Half baths. How many does my subject have?
1.
1. How many does my comp have? 0. So which way do I need to adjust? Up by the value of a half bath, and that's going to be plus $6,000. So my overall adjustment for the bathrooms is going to be minus $3,000. But I have to do it in 2 steps like that. Does that make sense?
Can't you just subtract the 6 from the
Once you
come up
figure
with-
that out,
Okay.
absolutely you can. Absolutely you can. But until you learn to recognize it's the difference between the two, the best way to do it is with 2 steps like that. Garages work the same way. Garages work the same way. How many 1-car garages do you have and how many 2-car garages? So when you see a house has a 1-car garage, you write 1 car and 0 2 cars. When you see a house has a 2-car garage, you write 0 1 car and 1 2 car, because you're going to have to adjust both of them and make them equal.
Is there a difference in the price between the garages if they're attached and detached?
Not for your purposes on the test. In the real world, yes, absolutely. I mean, would a buyer be willing to pay more for an attached garage than a detached garage in most cases? Yes, I get wet with a detached garage. I do not get wet with an attached garage.
Would you do a garage example like you had that for
I
us?
will do a garage example.
Just so we can get used to the right one.
Yep. How about if I use the same numbers?
There we go.
Sure.
2-car,
It's heated. If it's
1 car.
unheated space.
Okay? So, my subject has a 2-car garage. So, I'm going to write 1-car garage. 0. Right?
Yep.
2-car garage. Oh, sorry. 1. 1, right?
Yep.
That's how I write down a 2-car garage. Now over here, for 1 car, I put what? 1. And 2 car, I put 0. I've got to make both of them be the same, right? So I do the first adjustment for the 1-car garage. My subject has no 1-car garage. My comp has a 1-car garage. Which way am I adjusting?
Down.
Down. So I'm subtracting
6,000.
the value of a 1-car garage, right? So minus 6,000.
Where'd you get this?
It's on
Sorry.
board.
Same numbers.
Oh, whoops.
And then the 2-car. My subject has a 2-car. My comp does not. So I'm going up by the value of a 2-car, which is plus what? Plus 9,000. So my overall adjustment is going to be what? Plus $3,000. That help?
Thank you.
Yep. Yes.
If the bathroom is in the garage, can you count that as part of,
If the bathroom's in the garage,
if they have a bath that is in the garage,
sure.
do you
I mean,
count that as part of the house? I'm saying because it's not.
Unfinished space?
You're not going to, first of all, none of that's going to be on the test.
Okay.
Second of all, you're asking questions that you already know the answer to.
So you would count.
You're asking questions you already know the answer to. Is a bathroom in a garage worth something?
Yes.
Is it worth nearly what it would be as if it was in the house? And there you go. See, value's not a hard thing. Think of yourself as a shopper, right? And people do this all the time because they want a different answer. Well, I have a basement. It's not so bad that you have to go outside to get to it. Yes, it freaking is. It's horrible. Because in the middle of a damn tornado, when you want to go to the basement so you don't blow away, you're going to blow away going down the stairs. when you ask these questions, once you get in the real world, you're just asking very logical questions. Does it have value? Yes. Does it have as much value as it would if it were, more in the regular living space? And the answer is no. So it's going to be somewhere between 0 and whatever the regular number is. And it's very subjective what it is on that scale in between there, but it's somewhere between those two. When people ask me, well, what is basement square footage worth? I say, well, is it worth something? And the answer is always what?
Yes.
Yes. Is it worth as much as it would be if it was above ground?
No.
No. So it's worth somewhere between those two numbers. And where it lands between those two numbers is very much the subjective of whoever's doing the value, right? Whether it's 20% less or 30% less, it's something less. It's not all the way up there and it's not all the way down here. Somewhere in between. Okay? We good with the adjustment so far? Feel all right with the adjustment? Good. So let's do this then. Last one. Sorry. We haven't done time yet. We have to adjust for time as well. Remember, we said the best comps are ones that are recently what? Sold. Recently sold. Well, what if they're not so recently sold? We can still use them, but we have to try to adjust for the time. So I'll give you an example. Let's say I'm doing a CMA today, and there hasn't been any sales. If this is a Cary neighborhood, what's the market like in Cary right now?
Appreciating.
It's appreciating like crazy. It's booming, right? The market's booming. So there haven't been any sales in this neighborhood for the last 6 months. My most recent comps are 6 months old. If those same properties sold today, would they sell for less, the same, or more than they sold 6 months ago? More. So does it make sense then that we need to make an adjustment to their sales price based on that? If we're trying to predict what a property would sell for right now, and we're using values that are 6 months old, we need to make an adjustment for that. Does everybody follow that? Yes. Okay? Because our data is a little bit old. That's called appreciation. All right? And appreciation is going to be a positive adjustment. Depreciation is going to be a negative adjustment. Is everybody with me on that? Okay, so just as an example here, it says a comp sold 7 months ago for $280,000 in a neighborhood that's been appreciating at a rate of 4% annually. Now remember, appreciation is just an adjustment like any other. So you would have your chart set up, you got your subject property, you got your comparable property, and let's say we've done all our other adjustments. We've got square footage that we've adjusted for, and we've got number of baths that we're adjusted for, and so we've done, we've gotten all this done. Well, we're going to take one last adjustment. That adjustment's going to be for appreciation. Does that make sense for everybody? So our last adjustment down here is going to be for appreciation. And what it tells us about this property is that it sold how long ago? 7 months. Now, had it sold a full year ago, how much would it have appreciated?
4%.
4%, but it didn't sell a full year ago. So what we have to do is figure out how much it would have appreciated for a whole year and then break that down. Does that make sense for everybody? So what did it sell for? $280,000. And if it sold a full year ago, how much more would it have gone up in value?
4%.
4%. So if we take 4%, we get $11,200 in annual appreciation, which we need to break down to what kind of appreciation? Monthly. So we're going to divide this by what?
12.
And what that gives us, what, 933.33?
Yeah.
Times how many months? 7 months, and that is 65.33, roughly, some change in appreciation. So we come back over here, our appreciation adjustment. Is that going to be a plus or a minus? Plus 65.33.31. So say our comp had sold for $200,000, we would just add that number. Actually, they told us it sold for $280. Sorry, it said it sold for $280. So we would just add that 65. So our adjusted value would be $286,533 $2.31. Now, here's the big thing with appreciation, most common mistake. You do the appreciation adjustment off of the sales price, not off of after you've done all your adjustments over here, right? Don't take all these adjustments and then use that number. Take the top line number to do your appreciation or depreciation. Everybody understand
Even
what
though you did it last, you still take it.
And so therefore, if that you find it confusing, you can do it first if you
Okay,
wanted to.
okay.
You can do it first if that's gonna be your reminder,
Okay.
okay? But you always appreciate or depreciate on the actual sales price. All right, we good with that? Okay, so this is the final note, and then we're gonna do some practice with it. Generally speaking, we wanna have how many comps? At least how many? At least 3, and never more than 5. At least 3, never more than 5. Every one of them is going to give you a different indicated value. That's the way this works. Every time you do a comp, each comp is going to produce an individual value. So if I had 3 comps, what do you think I'm going to end up with? 3 values. You, as a broker and on a test, would report a range of value. You don't go any further than that. You don't try to pick one number from one of the 3, or you don't average the 3 of them together. You don't get any more fine than what you got. So if you got 3 numbers, what do you say? The property's worth somewhere between this number and this number. It's called a range of value. You say the probable sales price is somewhere between here and here. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay. Appraisers will give an exact number. We don't do that. And they don't use averaging either. If that's all they give me, we could do it too. But that's not how they get to their exact number. They have a very complex process to get to there. But luckily, we don't have to teach you how to do it. Alright? So, let's do this. Let's take a break. And when we come back, we're going to start working on some math examples. We're going to go through some math examples of this.